So welcome, and this is, I have to tell you a little story about this whole Chad with you thing. You know, Dave White and others who were at the university when I first came, they all said, hey, would you be interested in teaching a class or lectures and so on? And honestly, I did not want to because it's just way too much work. You guys know this, a lot of work, and but rewarding, but a lot of work. So I thought that I would propose something so wacky that they wouldn't actually agree to do it, right? So I said, hey, what about something called Climate Chat with you? And only at ASU this would happen. Thumbs up. So we're here for the inaugural edition of Chat with You and Climate Chat with You. And the other thing I have to share with you is that I have done chats with you for over a decade now at EPA. And the purpose in doing it was really to bring together people to network in large organizations like EPA. And I think ASU is pretty similar as well. We have so many people working on many different disciplines. And you tend to get so stovepiped and siloed that you don't have opportunities to network with people. And also the other is at EPA, I used to bring in people from outside. Our regulated industry folks, our state folks, and so on, so that we get an exposure to people that either are recipients of our service or people doing work with us outside. So the purpose of my chats, climate chats with you here, is really the same, which is to bring all of you together from time to time. So hopefully after this, there's going to be networking and conversation. But most importantly, I wanted to bring in really distinguished practitioners from outside the university that I know that I'm working with, and practitioners who are doing what I call frontier work, particularly in the climate solution space. And so if you think about these types of objectives that I have for climate chats with you, I couldn't have thought of a better first guest than Laurie Collins, because I think she's doing work that I think most of you probably think is not in the domain of work you're doing. But the challenge of tackling climate change and the impacts of climate change, as we talk about always, is all hands on deck, right? Everyone, it touches every aspect of our lives and touches every discipline that we're teaching our students and what we're learning. So a lot of the work that hopefully we'll be highlighting, and Laurie's work in particular this morning, will highlight some of the things that Laurie's doing and others are thinking about, and that perhaps we're not connected with. So, I hope actually that if you think about a Venn diagram of where you are, and many of you are kind of in overlapping spaces, but I hope that Laurie's space doesn't touch many of you right now, but hopefully after today's chat that you'll think that actually this is a space that you're working in with Laurie and others as well. One more thing to share. I call this a chat because I do and would like all of you to think about participating with us. So we'll have time for our chats initially, and then we'll kind of come to you for a discussion. And I do have chocolates, and yeah, and those of you who came up to my first lecture will know. Do feel free to give Laurie snaps. Come on.
Oh.
Let's hear it. Right. I know we have a small crew, but I know you're going to be active, right? So let's give us some snaps. And if you kind of agree, positive feedback for Laurie, please give her some snaps, all right? The one final thing that I wanted to just mention about the format is that I was a huge fan. Again, Laurie, it's a pop reference that you and I will remember. Not everyone else will, but growing up, I was a huge fan of the Johnny Carson show. What I loved about his show was that it wasn't about the movie stars and the movies or music stars and the music, but and their image, their curated image. What I hope to do with Laurie is to explore also who Laurie is and what passion and what background and how her journey brought to what she's doing. Because I think one of the questions that I get from students often is, hey, how do I do what Laurie's doing? How do I do what Dave White is doing? And it is a really tough question to answer, other than to share with you journeys that other people have taken to come to this point. And last night, I hope you were all at the I forgot what it was called, the water. Women in Water, yeah, that was an outstanding session. I was only able to sit in for first hour, but it was just really impressive group of women who are leaders in water issues in the state of Arizona, and the journeys that they've taken, just fascinating. And I hope that you'll find Laurie's journey interesting and fascinating, and hopefully that'll share, at least particularly for students who are trying to get into climate solution space, that it'll provide some guideposts or experience as well. So with that, Laurie, welcome. And I shared with Laurie, because we're going to talk about her, I'm not going to do a big introduction. So I'll let her do a lot of the introduction herself. So Laurie, how about if I turn to you for a few words before I ask you some questions?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. As I was chatting earlier, my nephew is in school here at the School of Earth and Space Exploration. So, it's just kind of fun to be on his campus and learn more about the university. Actually, I'm kind of interested, before we jump in, to get a little sense of the audience. So I know that you could be from business, science, law. So how many folks are from the business school or from something in business? All right. And then anybody from the law school? So how about engineering? Okay, there's
mostly sustainability folks, it sounds like.
Okay, so all right, okay. So then, where are you? What school are you in? I mean, what part of the university? Oh, sustainability. Okay, so there's a separate. Okay, so most of you from the School of Sustainability then. Okay, all right. Well, great. We just kind of wanted to get a sense of who is here. So as you probably know, I work with Ed on the EPA advisory board. That's how we met. So Ed asked me to just give you a little sense of my background and a little bit of the story of how I got into this space. So I started off in financial services. I worked for Bank of America, then I got an MBA at Kellogg at Northwestern, and started my career in marketing financial services. I worked for names you've heard of: American Express, Fidelity Investments in Boston, Bank of America, which is headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's what got me back to North Carolina. And then I worked for a company called LendingTree. You probably are familiar with LendingTree. It's been around for a long time, but when I went there, it was a startup. So I had the full Silicon Valley startup experience in Charlotte. We went through the whole thing. We were there when the NASDAQ crashed. We got venture funding, then we went public. We sort of survived that. We ended up selling to a media leader. It's called IAC, but they own Hotels.com, TripAdvisor, Expedia. So that's the company that bought LendingTree. So we went through that, and then we still stayed for a few years, and then eventually, I was able to cash out from these various transactions, and I really didn't have that much passion for mortgage, although I love LendingTree and the whole startup experience. But when I cashed out, I was still pretty young, and I felt honestly, I felt very fortunate to have been able to have this startup experience, and I still had a lot of gas in my tank. I mean, I wasn't going to retire, and I wanted to do something more meaningful that had some humanitarian value that mattered to the world. I didn't necessarily feel like the mortgage business was saving lives or anything. And I worked with coaches. I went through read all the books. What color is your parachute? I really tried to figure out what I wanted to do. And to be honest, it took me a while. It took about 3 years, I would say. And I was doing some things in the meantime, but I tried the arts. I spent a lot of time in Africa. I went to Africa like 8 times. I spent a lot of time in Africa thinking maybe that was my passion, go that direction. I spent some time with nonprofits. It just took me a while to just really kind of figure out. And I really tried to pay attention to what kind of, how I felt about things. Like, sort of, is this pulling into a passion. I don't think, and people would say, well, you should just work on your passion. And I felt like if one more person says that to me, if I knew my passion, I would already be on it. Like, it's not that easy, I didn't think, to find my passion. I personally did not think that was very easy. And so I just tried to pay attention to how I felt about things. And very randomly, I was able to have dinner with, sitting next to Tom Friedman, who is the journalist who's written The World is Flat, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. He's recently written, Thank You for Being Late. And it was just a fluke. I mean, just sort of side note, we were at this big dinner and Jim Rogers was supposed to sit next to Tom Friedman. Jim Rogers was CEO of Duke Energy, and he didn't show up. He got stuck on a flight and he didn't show up. And the president of Queen's University, where we were hosting this, was in a panic, like, we don't have anybody sitting next to Tom Friedman. And she said, you, Lori, I know you, I trust you, you sit next to Tom Friedman. I mean, it was just completely random. And I was just over the moon. I was so excited to have a chance to talk to Tom Friedman. I had read The World is Flat and Hot, Flat, and Crowded. And both of those books made me just feel like I just want to like run out of the room and do something, like my hair is on fire, like I just need to do something. But how do you get started? I had no background. I was in my mid-40s. I had no background in science, environment. It wasn't even clear the difference between energy and environment. Like, how are those different? So I had no idea where to get started in this. But I thought, okay, I am on the ceiling. I am so excited to have a chance to talk to Tom Friedman. Like, I should pay attention to this. Like, I should figure out like some way to do this. I thought, I'm going to just try to get into energy, whatever that means. And so then right after that, okay, I'm probably giving you more detail than you need, so just cut me off.
Actually, before you get to the moment on this, I do want to share that Lori, you hear her accent, right? I mean, she said she went back to Charlotte, but you have your family, you guys have a long history in North Carolina. And I joke around that you could probably be a member of Daughters of American
Yes, my
Revolution.
relatives served in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, so, one of the things that I found very interesting, not just her midlife crisis, mid-career crisis, and how she found a cause on climate solutions, but even early on, right? And you went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and your family was very much connected with the North Carolina State University. But tell everyone the story about how you ended up going away from North Carolina. Also, that also was a very random journey, I felt, but that led you into all of this.
Okay, you mean when I went to Chicago?
Yes.
Okay. So I grew up in North Carolina. I went to the University of North Carolina, and I was working for North Carolina National Bank. And, at age like 24, I'm thinking, how am I ever going to break out of this? I was telling Ed, I wanted to be more like Mary Tyler Moore, but he said nobody would remember who Mary Tyler Moore was.
Did anybody remember Mary Tyler Moore? Okay,
you
guys are
throwing
all...
your hat. That's what I pictured, being this independent woman in a big city, throwing my hat in there. And I thought, well, I don't see any way I'm going to ever get there. I'm like, everything on my resume says North Carolina. I've got this accent. Like, how am I ever going to break out of this? And so I had all these ideas. I was telling Ed, I thought, maybe I'll move to Boston. I'll get a master's in English. I was all over the map. I did not really know what I wanted to do. And if you look at my resume, I look very focused, but it really wasn't.
And a banker.
Yeah, I was working at North Carolina National Bank, which is now Bank of America. So, I thought, well, I'll take the GMAT in case I want to go to business school, but that seems so boring. I don't want to go to business school, but I just to have the option, I took the GMAT. And then I started thinking, well, I guess I'll go look at schools. But I really was not committed to this idea, but I was just exploring. I thought I need to generate some options for myself. So I visited Kellogg at Northwestern, and I went up there in January. I tied it into a business trip. It was apparently the coldest weekend they'd had in 20 years in Chicago. And this did not faze me. You know, when I came home and told my parents about it, I did not mention the weather. So my mother was like, she's gone. You know, she didn't even mention the weather. She's totally fine with it. I think it was literally like 20 degrees below zero that weekend, but I thought it was exciting. Yeah, I just thought it was kind of cool. And I loved the campus at Northwestern and Evanston. And I was just totally sold. I loved Chicago. I was sold. And you know, I put something on my on my application. Well, I did show up for an interview. That I will say, you know, like they say half of life is showing up. And I think that really has something, just the fact that I showed up and had an interview. Not everybody bothered to go to campus and do that. But I think I wrote in my application that I wanted to be in corporate treasury management, which is because it was something I was working in banking. I could write an essay on that. I really wanted to be in marketing, but I didn't know how to write. I knew so little about marketing. I didn't know how to write an application on that. So at the time, I mean, I'll just, you know, also, I mean, Northwestern had very few Southerners. So I'm sure I covered a lot of diversity. You know, there was Southern. I think there was only 10% Southerners at Northwestern at the time. So I was Southern, I was female, and at the time, Northwestern was known as a marketing school. So the fact that I wrote my essay on corporate treasury management probably helped me get in because they wanted more finance. So, you know, I really, so I got in and majored in marketing. But at the time, the things I was looking for, I try to have three criteria. That sort of simplifies my life. You know, I thought I want to get out of the South. I've got to break out of this North Carolina. I want to live near a big city and I want a marketing school. You know, even though I wrote my application for finance. And to me, you know, besides the fact that I just fell in love with it, it checked all the boxes. And in North Carolina, people could not believe that I didn't choose to go to Darden. First of all, they're like, oh, you're never going to get into Darden. Well, I did get into Darden. And my roommate went to Virginia undergrad, and she just couldn't believe that I got into Darden and that I turned it down. But I thought, okay, Darden in Virginia meets none of my three criteria. It's not, you know, out of the South. It's not near a big city, and it's not known for marketing. It doesn't meet any of my criteria. So, you know, so I went to Kellogg, and I had, you know, I had a great experience there. And so, you know, from there, moved to New York City and worked for American Express. And I was still a little, you know, wide-eyed, I would say, because I was thought it was so interesting that when I was having my interview at American Express, they were having dinner that night with Carl Malden. I'm sure nobody remembers Carl Malden either, but at the time, no one, don't leave home without it. It was their big tagline, and he was an actor, and he was a star of all the American Express ads at the time. So that was the beginning of I was already in, you know, I was in banking, but that was the beginning of the financial services marketing part of it.
So banking. So one of the reasons that I'm asking you to talk about this is that, you know, your career, I think you pointed out, is sort of you've taken a lot of roads that you thought at the time opened doors for you. And I think you were very successful in doing that. But many of us have the same kinds of stories, right? Particularly those of us who are not in the academic arena, but in practice. I could share my experiences like that as well. But now, if you could share a little more about where you left off earlier, about when you started getting into sustainability work, green finance, because I think that's where we want to get to some of the discussions around the topic. But I wanted everyone to kind of hear how you got here, and now I'd love to hear more about your passion and why you got into this, what the pivotal moment for you was.
Yeah, so, you know, I kind of explained how I got focused in on this idea of energy. You know, I don't know at the time that I would have necessarily explained it as climate change, but I guess, you know, the world is flat and hot, flat, and crowded. Those are big motivators. And I thought, okay, I have zero background in this. I mean, I'm going to try to tie it to my financial background. And, you know, to be honest, I was like late 40s. You know, I was later in my career when all this started. And so, you know, I just got started. I started reading everything I could. I read from a lot of different angles. I networked a lot. I would go to conferences and just talk to people. At the beginning, you feel like, it's just how am I going to get going? How am I going to learn this? And another thing that I guess just felt like a fluke. I was having it was a Sunday. I was having brunch with a friend and saying, okay, I have no idea how to get going. And she said, well, why don't you take the LEAD exam? And it's anybody, well, you're in sustainability, you know what
Yeah.
LEAD is. And so I thought, okay, so I went home and looked it up. And the very next day was going to be April 30th. It was the last day. This is in probably 2007 or so. It was the last day that a regular like civilian that didn't work in engineering or whatever could take the LEAD exam and get the AP for life without being in the industry. And I thought, well, that just felt like, okay, you got to do it. It just galvanized me. Like literally tomorrow is the last day you can sign up to take this exam, and you have to take it and pass it by June 30th. And then, that was the last chance to get the full-blown LEAD AP. And so I thought, well, that's a sign. I'm going to do that. So I wasn't working for some reason, I wasn't working at the time. So I just studied for 3 months. I did all the tests. I, talked to people. If there was something I just couldn't understand, I'd go, call someone in the industry and have them explain it to me. I went to the hardware store a few times to say, what is a ballast? Like, I need to see this. I don't get what this is. I mean, I just, that was my focus. And it also kind of reassured to me, like I'm sitting at my kitchen table studying wastewater management and I'm into it. Like I found my inner engineer, like where I had no idea I would ever be interested in this. So that was like a first step because it gave me a credential and it demonstrated to other people that I wasn't just a enthusiast, that nobody goes through that just for the heck of it. So it started demonstrating like I'm serious. And then anyway.
Did you take another, I may have misunderstood, but did you take another degree or did you?
I eventually got another degree. So that was my first credential. One of the first jobs I got in this space, they really liked that I had the LEAD AP. I mean, they like promoted that. So I worked in the industry. I don't know if I need to go through every role, but the first job I got was just through networking. They liked my financial background. We were doing financing for energy projects. They wanted somebody with the finance background. So that was kind of my first break. And they really liked my lending tree background. They thought they would use it. And as it turned out, we didn't even go in that direction. But I worked there for a couple of years. That's where I met Michael Regan, who's now head of the EPA, was like through that experience. So he was like.
This is the first time I'm hearing about this though.
Well, he worked for the Environmental and Defense Fund, but we were working with him as like an advisor or something. But he was, he just was like working for the local Environmental Defense Fund. He was just like a regular guy, it's just like, wow, like now he's head of the EPA. You just never know where things will go. And then I left that role and I ran an accelerator program that was funded by Duke Energy. They had just gotten the funding for it. And, I was really passionate about startups because I'd had my lending tree experience. So I thought, great, this is funded. They've got money and we can marry my interest in startups with my interest in clean energy. And so that was really interesting. So I did that for a few years. But I kept thinking, I'm just kind of casting around learning from my colleagues. I kept thinking I'd really like to get some kind of degree in this. And I would think, I could go to Johns Hopkins, I could who has environmental finance degrees, but I wasn't sure environmental finance, environmental science. It just seemed kind of wide open. I couldn't quite picture myself just moving to Washington, D.C. for a year. I couldn't quite figure out how to do it. And there was a woman that I was working on an environmental grants committee just as a volunteer. And there was a woman who was like my mom's age that knew I was sort of interested. And she kept saying, my daughter-in-law did this program in Scotland. And I really didn't know her that well. She just kept encouraging me. I think that there's these little angels in your life sometimes. She has no idea how much influence she had. So for like 2 years, she kept saying, my daughter-in-law. And then her daughter-in-law was in town, and I thought her daughter-in-law was really interesting because she'd had a marketing career at Bank of America. She did this program in Scotland, and 1 year later, she's working for the Department of Energy. And I thought, well, that's, that really like changed her career trajectory in 1 year. I still couldn't figure out how am I going to move to Scotland for a year. I have cats, I have a house. I wasn't married at the time, but I couldn't quite figure out how to make this work. Anyway, everything fell into place. I did move to Scotland for a year, and I got a master's in carbon management, which sounds very technical, but it wasn't that technical. I mean, it was sort of a survey. We took carbon management. We took a class on what they called adaptation, was basically science. I took an energy policy class. I mean, so to me, it was like skimming the surface, totally skimming the surface. But that's where I learned a lot of the climate language. I mean, I just thought in terms of clean energy and energy efficiency before that. And so after a year with this carbon management degree, I thought more in terms of mitigation, resilience, adaptation, sort of the IPCC language. And I also got the European point of view. I had this idea that the Europeans are so far ahead of Americans, but after a whole year, I was like, no, I'm going to go back to the U.S. We get things done, So that was sort of like a helpful. And then, after I got this degree, I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't live in New York or Washington, D.C., and I want to have a career in climate in Charlotte, North Carolina. What am I going to do with this degree? I couldn't quite see it. And also, I was later in my career, so I thought, I don't want an entry-level job. What am I gonna do with this? So right when I was coming back, a friend of mine kept saying, oh, you've got to come to New York Climate Week. You'll meet everyone. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go. And then like literally 2 weeks before I was going, I thought, wait, if I'm gonna go up there and spend a whole week and spend all this money and meet all these people, I have to have a business card. What am I gonna put on my business card? What's the point of networking with no business card? And my friend said, Collins Climate Consulting. Just say your name, what you're doing, just own it. Now hang up and go buy the URL from GoDaddy, just do it. And it was sort of the imposter feeling, like, okay, what is this? But you just have to get started. I guess that's part of it. You just have to get started. So that's how I got started.
The reason that I wanted Lori to tell her story, come on, snap. So one of the things that I really appreciate about you is that not just the journey that you've taken and a career change and following your passion, but the lesson that I kind of affirms for me, and I think for a lot of folks, particularly who are kind of our vintage, is the fact that you have to take action and creating networks and taking advantage of every opportunity that comes your way. I think that's what I take out of your experience. And, I hope that Dave is shaking his head, and I kind of, Dave is just an incredible networker. He knows everyone, right? And I just feel the same way with Lori. And when I met Lori, I mean, she was already past this point in her journey, right? She's become known, and that climate week wasn't when I met you. So
no, it was a later climate week.
Yeah, later climate week. But the idea is that I wanted folks to see Lori's background is totally unorthodox, but the bottom line is that her incredible knowledge of the banking and the finance sector, not overlapping with the climate and green finance. She discovered that later, and she is now, I would say, from EPA and other people's perspective, one of the most important people in our space. And I will say that. And just leave it at that. And you'll see why. So we're going to get into the report a little bit now.
Okay.
So fast forward, we got to know each other. And one of the things that Lori and I, at least last few years before you started working on this, we shared our passion about finding money, I would say, for communities and others who are impacted by climate change. What people call climate resilience funding or climate adaptation funding or climate investments. And so I asked Lori actually to help me get connected with folks, and she helped me get connected with folks in New York, but also to host some panels. So she actually hosted a panel for the Environmental Financial Advisory Board. But the information at the time, this was just, I would say, 3 years ago, there wasn't a lot of information. There hasn't been a lot of work thinking about this and how to bring kind of the private investors into this market, right? So, but it turns out that there were a group of people who were interested in the same thing. And so we're going to go with this now is those groups of people that I'll ask Lori to describe came to Lori and the organization that Lori is part of and asked them to do this groundbreaking report. And so we're going to get into that report, but just to continue this journey and the networking and other things that you've shared with us, tell everyone how and why this report, the story, the backstory of how this report and the coalition of people who funded this came together. And then we'll get into the report a bit, because I think people should hear the fact that this isn't a straight line either.
Yeah, and so the big issue that this report is focused on, and the folks that work on it, is how do we get more private sector funding in the climate space? So there, as you probably know, there's the kind of two buckets. There's what's called mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gases. That's clean energy and energy efficiency,
electric vehicles and other.
Yeah, electric vehicles, electrification. So that's all about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that, maybe 10 years ago was controversial and somewhat political, but at this point, that is very well established. There's the very well-established business case. There's already billions of dollars going into mitigation, or some people call it decarbonization. So that's kind of covered. I mean, there's still work to be done, but on the other side is, okay, what about what's already happening? So while these people are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's a lot of issues that are hitting us, and this is maybe a time that we can put this, let's see if this is up here. Oop, I went the wrong way. Let's see. Oh, I'm holding it upside down. That's why it's going the wrong way. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this up here. So this is a really clear demonstration that climate change is not something out in the future. It is impacting us right now. So you can look at this chart, starts at 1980. How many billion-dollar disasters were there in the US? And there's just a pretty steady trajectory. Last year, there were 28 separate events, each of which was $1 billion in disaster. So right now, this is considered a government problem. Like, it's just up to the governments and the relief organizations to go in and clean up after the disasters. But you see this and you think, okay, it's happening right now. We cannot just sit back and constantly react. I mean, in terms of financially, it doesn't make sense. It definitely doesn't make sense in terms of just human loss, lives lost, property loss. So to me, this is like a really kind of hit you in the face. We've got to be better equipped to deal with what's already happening. And if you're in sustainability, you probably know the terms resilience and adaptation. So resilience, the ability to bounce back quickly. Adaptation, changing long-term structures and processes to adapt to a new world. So there's almost no money going into this world of adaptation for the private sector. And when I say private sector, I mean publicly traded, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, publicly traded companies. Could be private equity or venture capital, it could be pension funds. So that's what I mean when I say private sector, not government, not NGOs. It's like 2% of all the money in this whole space is from private sector. And Ed was asking me over breakfast, well, why is that? And it's sort of a combination of things. One, it's just been assumed that's government's job. That's a line item on a government budget. And second, I would say companies don't really know what's needed. Well, what do you mean? Like, okay, are we just talking seawalls? what do you even mean by adaptation? What are the products that would help? We're a private company. We're not going to be building seawalls. So companies don't understand what it is that would be considered. And then third, companies, investors think, well, I can't make money on that. How do I make money on a seawall? Like there's no return on investment. So that's kind of the combination of reasons that there's been, no money going into this. So there's not enough government money to continue to deal with that, not to mention just all the loss of life and property. And also just from a business view, that's no way to run a business. And this is in the US. Think about in Africa and Southeast Asia, it's just a huge humanitarian crisis. They're just being wiped out. And those governments absolutely don't have the money. At least in the US, we can't afford it. But those countries don't have the money. So we can't just sit back and just watch this huge humanitarian crisis. It could be from flooding, hurricanes. It could be drought that leads to famine. I mean, you can just, since we have the data and we know it's going to happen, I think there's like sort of a moral imperative. We got to do something. So how do we get the private sector to see a path for a way to participate? So in this paper, which we are now calling the unavoidable opportunity, so the idea of unavoidable opportunity is like these risks at this point are unavoidable. Even if we went to net zero tomorrow, we already have enough carbon in the atmosphere that some of this is going to happen no matter what. And so it's unavoidable. And so given that it's unavoidable, there's also like an unavoidable opportunity. It's gonna happen. It's more, one of the things that we say in the paper is, investors love certainty. So if you want certainty, knowing that climate is coming and these issues are gonna happen is more certain than the trajectory of interest rates, what's gonna happen with inflation. I mean, it's one of the most clear risks. So take that off the table. So that's the first part of the paper, is to build the case that this is a huge opportunity. I mean, in business language, so these increasing climate risks are going to drive demand for solutions. We have to have solutions. We have to have products and services. We can't just sit here and let this happen to us.
So Lori, I do want to point out to those of you who have not read, you didn't do your homework and didn't read the report before you came. There are interesting information in there. One thing that's notable is how little, what percentage of the global spending now, not necessarily investment, goes to adaptation efforts.
Yeah, 2%.
2%. But over 90% of that is public money, right? And that public money, I believe they're not investments, right? They're actually spending on disaster.
Yeah.
So pretty much based on that, how I interpreted that is that there's virtually zero investment in adaptation in the private marketplace right now. Yeah. And the government money, they're not investments. I mean, I repeat that again.
Right. It's not investment. It's not something that's going to
disasters.
Yeah,
right?
It's reactive. It's not like investment being something that's, going to build back and get a return.
Oh, and I just also want to, I really do appreciate the way you made the kind of the risk and the certainty issue clear, because a lot of folks will talk about there's just not enough information, lack of clarity. So that's one of the barriers for investments. And clearly the other is a return. So we'll talk about that. But I do want to kind of reiterate that what I found interesting, you as an author saying that in the report that it's going to happen. The question is, I think there still has to be, for at least the academics and Noah and others, we do have to look at where those risks are going to take place. And, there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think what you're saying is that climate is actually having impact on drought, right? Heat, and, wildfires, flooding. And so the question is, how precise do you think that we're going to, do you have any comments on that before we get to the returns issue?
I don't know. I don't think it can be that precise. I mean, you can even see from this chart, some years are down. So, someone who didn't who wanted to refute this could say, oh, look at 1987. Nothing happened in 1987. This is just a fluke. But if you look at the long-term trajectory, it's clear as day, but someone could pick at it. You can't pinpoint exactly which year. Well, there's more and more data companies, more climate data companies being developed that are helping drive that precision. Google has a new product for flood analytics that helps determine and project precipitation levels and flood levels and how they're going to impact certain regions. So it is getting a lot more sophisticated to pinpoint, but I think in general, there's a bigger picture than that. I mean, you can see we need solutions. So the first part, I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to keep going on this. The first part of the paper is basically laying out the case that this is a undeniable opportunity. So climate risk drives demand for solutions, whatever those solutions are. We got to do something. And, you know, in the business world, demand drives investment opportunity. If you're an investor, you're going to want to invest in the Nike shoes that are selling. I mean, it's just human nature. If you're an investor, you want to go where the demand is, the demand for products. So demand drives investment opportunity. So the second part of the paper helps answer the question, like, what are we talking about? What do you mean a solution? So the paper goes, this is just sort of illustrative. There's been a lot of debate, like, can you give me a list? You know, the investors, I've had investors say point blank, I want a list of every possible solution. And we so far have resisted that idea of giving a list, but this kind of goes through here's the key impact drivers: extreme heat, drought, storms, sea level rise. And then we go through every sector, agriculture, real estate, et cetera, by sector, and give some examples. There's several pages. I just put this one up. There's a companion document called CRISP. And I don't know, so there's the paper, and then there's another paper that
I shared the link.
Okay.
Yeah.
So CRISP, I know we like acronyms. We like to make something sound, you know, so it's not so hard to say. The Climate Resilient Investment Solution Principles. Anyway, CRISP is a framework that goes in a little bit more detail to explain, you know, what are we talking about by sector, and give examples so that investors kind of understand what is a solution. So that's, you know, that's the CRISP document. These are some examples. And then the third part of the paper takes all of this framework and examples and uses artificial intelligence to overlay against thousands of company descriptions. And so we determined, okay, we think there's over 800 companies on publicly traded, you know, like New York Stock Exchange, that are doing this kind of work. So they don't call themselves climate companies, but we're identifying them as climate companies. We're identifying them as companies that, you know, you ask about returns. Well, these companies are publicly traded. They have returns. They have revenue. They're already doing it. And part of the reason we don't want to have a white list, black list, is because we feel like some things will evolve. I mean, for example, air filters. Well, air filters were not considered necessarily a climate product, but if you live in Seattle and there's tons of wildfires, then oh, you know, these air filters are starting to become more related to the wildfire risk. So it's sort of an evolving, you know, types of products that can be developed or applications
Well,
for
and
products.
in Seattle, we talked about the fact that Seattle is the least air-conditioned city in the country, metropolitan areas in the country. But they have now realized with the last 2 summers that there's a huge market for HVAC equipment in Seattle. Now, I would consider it just as like air filters in a similar category of products.
So it's kind of a moving target, or there could be products that haven't even been developed yet. So that's where we don't want to be giving investment advice. We're not going to release the names of the 800 companies. We're encouraging investors to kind of understand the process we went through. Like, we looked at a number of different AI tools and sort of came out with what we thought was the most effective. And so we're really encouraging investors to, open their eyes to what we mean by a climate solution. It's not just seawalls, and it's not funky technology that you're not familiar with. It's things you're familiar with. I mean, for one, GlaxoSmithKline, for example, is a big pharma company. Well, you read their reports, they're coming out with new vaccines and new drug treatments because there's new diseases that are emerging related to climate. When there's more heat, when heat comes earlier in the year, when there's flooding, there's a lot of standing water. All those things are generating new diseases. So GlaxoSmithKline is on the forefront of kind of getting ahead of it and developing this. So, that's an adaptation.
Well, and regarding vector-borne diseases and vaccines, I think you and I also talked about another industry sector that would come after, which is a refrigeration transportation.
Yeah, well, this was interesting. I mean, it's kind of climate, kind of pandemic. So Trane Technologies is kind of known for their HVAC units, for their air conditioning units. Their stock exploded during the pandemic because one of their lesser known products is Thermo King, which is a refrigerated trucking. And during the pandemic, they were like the only game in town for high volume refrigerated trucking, which was needed to transport the COVID vaccines. And they had their product already. They already had refrigerated trucking just for general commercial business. But then all of a sudden, it was like really critical because of COVID, which, you could even say COVID was related to climate potentially, but even if it's just an example of where something can have a new application as, things are changing. And so, Trane Technology stock has tripled since the pandemic because they really rose to the moment.
The other example, since kind of we're going to run out of time, so we'll get to some of the examples. But last summer in Phoenix, when there was this huge heat wave and the homelessness, and people were trying to figure out so this is a way of thinking about this, is where how do you find temporary solutions of having cooling buses, or if this is going to, as Lori says, that this is an impact that we're going to be feeling year in, year out, what does the market look like in terms of investments that are needed to address that issue more permanently? And I think that's the kind of framing that we've been talking about. So I can tell you wanted to talk about more examples.
No, I just would put this up. I mean, we're not releasing the names of the companies, but there's, this is for people in the investment world, they probably could figure out who this company was. So we went through, one of the issues is that if you're talking big publicly traded companies, they're probably not going to be 100% in this business. We call that a pure play. So we estimated how much of the company's revenue we thought was from adaptation. So, this is just to give you a taste for, what are we talking about? So this is a technology company. We had a pharmaceuticals company. Same thing in this case, we said 20% of the revenue. This was, largely about vaccines. And then the third one was an engineering company. So just trying to give you a taste for what are we talking about. And also, I'll just go to this chart, which is counterclockwise the way it's labeled. I'm not sure why it's done counterclockwise, but 42% of the companies are industrials. And then, the next big chunk is materials. So just to get a sense of what industries this is in, and you can see it's a lot of different industries. Well, I see that we don't have much time, so should we take questions?
We'll take questions on that. Now, one more thing I wanted to share is that Lori mentioned seawalls, and that perhaps doesn't fit into the categories of examples that we talked about. But there are, just as in the mitigation world where clean energy, there were times where there are lots of projects that should be funded, could not be funded. There were lots of subsidies and public funding that came along initially, right, even in the energy sector. And there's still opportunities for that, continuing opportunities for adaptation and resiliency side. And I don't want to be plugging my show in 2 weeks, but we're actually going to have a conversation with Green Bank advocates who are going to be here on April 17th, I think, to talk about that aspect of investments that are needed. So I think I just wanted to make sure that although we mentioned some examples, they don't actually fit perfectly into this paradigm with the Wall Street folks. So questions, I saw somebody there. Could you say who you are, please? Yeah. And where you're from?
Sure.
Yeah.
My name is Miriam Waltz, and I'm from Scottsdale, actually. But yeah, actually, I've got two questions. But I guess the first one is, I'm wondering who you think the ultimate user of this is.
Yeah.
Like, is it fund management firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, that kind of thing? And then kind of secondly, the thing that's been going through my mind, I just saw a Wall Street Journal article yesterday that ESG funds have had this big outflow of funds. And I'm kind of curious because this, in my mind, I equate it to ESG. So I just kind of trying to understand who the end user is and then kind of how it relates to the current things that are going on with ESG.
Okay, so the users, the real target market for this paper is, when I say investors, JP Morgan, BlackRock, Goldman. I mean, the big investors, pension funds like CalPERS is a big pension fund, or TIAA. We rolled this out at the Financial Times Climate Capital Live conference in London. So a lot of financial companies, we partnered on the data analytics with MSCI, which is a Wall Street data analytics company, similar to Bloomberg, not as big as Bloomberg. But the MS in MSCI stands for Morgan Stanley. So that came out of Morgan Stanley. So the target market initially is these big institutions. So we just launched this March 14th. We had coverage in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Marketplace, which is NPR, and Reuters. And then just a few days last Tuesday, we had our first investor briefing in New York. We had 110 people registered. So it was a range. I mean, it was some NGOs, it was, but BlackRock and Goldman were in the room. Some people joined virtually. So that's, and like after the meeting, they still wanted to talk and they want all these Lazard, which is a Chicago investment firm. I'm trying to think, I mean, just, all the big names that you would assume, they're interested. I mean, they were seeing it, they're trying to figure out. GIC is another big investment firm. We are looking at presenting this in Singapore, where our contacts at GIC are located. So, and a lot of those groups like BlackRock and Wellington was actually involved in this. That's one of the companies. So as part of this, we interviewed Wellington, Invesco, Jefferies, BlackRock, GIC, JP Morgan. I mean, so they're involved. I mean, they're like, as soon as the paper comes out, we want to see it. And they're already, kind of toying with this area around sustainable finance. And so they're trying to figure out how to take it into this area. They're already doing sustainable finance as in the mitigation side. So they're quite interested. A lot of people want the list. And anyway, so enough on that. And then on the ESG, I also work in ESG. And to me, this has nothing to do with ESG. It has nothing to do with it. This is, there's really no place on an ESG report that even asks about physical. They're just starting to ask about physical climate risks, like in PRI reporting. So it's just completely separate.
The only other thing that I want to add to this is that from a public kind of policy perspective, a lot of the resilient investment needs. This is really the core of the North-South debate in the global discussion, right? And I would also argue that this is the core of funding for places like Arizona, because even within the United States, impacts are felt differentially, and it's felt disproportionately in certain parts of the world and in the United States. So if you think of it that way, it's clearly, from a public policy perspective, also very critical that, given the fact that there's not going to be enough public money, that this market develops. And so I think that's why I wanted Laurie to talk about this, because this is sort of impetus we need, not only are we facing impacts, differential impacts, but we need to have these funding. So private funding or public funding. And I think the work that the folks are doing, I think this is also funded by Bezos.
Yeah,
Foundation.
this whole report was funded by the Bezos Earth Fund and Climate Works, which is based in Bezos in DC, Climate Works is in California. One thing I will say, it's a little bit a long way around the block, but the recent SEC ruling around climate risk disclosure, we think will eventually help drive demand. So, you know, if companies have to lay out all their climate risks to their investors, obviously the next question is going to be, well, what are you doing to shore up all these risks? And then the companies are going to start looking for ways to shore up their risk, which is going to drive demand for solutions. And that's part of the demand story. And demand drives investment. I mean, if you think about it, if you're investing in something, you're going to invest in something that, whether it's Nike tennis shoes or Apple iPhone, you want to invest where the demand is.
Yeah, and as an investor, I would like to know what companies are facing in terms of climate risk. So that's the SEC part of, I think, important discussion. So wait, hold on for the mic.
I'll make a very quick one here.
Yeah.
Lot of the crops, because of the.
Hey, please say your name, please.
My name is Netra Chetri. I'm from School for the Future of Innovation in Society. I'm a professor here. In a carbon-enriched climate, a lot of the crops, almost every plant, will lose their nutrition potential as much as 70%, zinc, iron, vitamin A, you name it. So my colleagues in sustainability might not like this. We have a couple of choices here. One is to go into breeding, a special breeding aspect so that the plant continue to produce in the natural state.
Right.
Other one is to invest on fortification, which we already do. You know, so are there any sort of a discussion around that? Because it's a health issue, it's a well-being issue.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I would say under let's see if it's up here. Yeah, so under climate adaptation products, right at the top in agriculture, drought tolerant crops. So companies that are developing, you know, whether it's, you know, just however they're developing it through crop breeding or just brand new crops. So, and then things like irrigation technologies. So that's, yeah, that's considered an adaptation solution. Adaptation being kind of long-term solution.
We've been talking about that for a long time, but for the specific nutrition aspect.
Well, I mean, I guess just in general, you know, companies that are doing those things would be considered investable companies under this framework. This is not an exhaustive list. We say up there in tiny print, illustrative, not exhaustive. This is just, you know, examples. So something like that would be, yes, that would be picked up and considered. Hi.
Sustainability also based in zero waste department. My question is, what's sort of your take on terms like sustainability and ESG take negative connotation?
Okay, let me think about how to answer that. So I guess one thing that this is just my personal view, that I feel like when language gets in the way, it's better just to try to use some different language, because you can find a lot more common ground if you find language that works for everyone. So I personally feel like if this idea of ESG is been politicized or has some negative connotations, just find some different language, which is essentially what Larry Fink at BlackRock is trying to do, because we don't want to lose the big picture over the language. So I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I mean, I work in ESG, so I really see what's being asked and what's really there. And honestly, there's some things that I think are getting into too much detail. Sometimes I feel like you can lose sight of the big picture. But the most important thing is to focus on the purpose of it. What are you trying to accomplish? And if you can meet your goal with some different language, just don't get tangled up in it. I mean, I don't know if that's helpful to you. Yeah.
So I have a slight addition to that. I think the core of what you're asking is, a lot of people think that ESG reporting is greenwashing, right? And I think one of the challenges associated with that, I think Lori's kind of skirting around this, but are you actually reporting what should be reported, right? I mean, in terms of, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And is it something that would withstand scrutiny, right? And I think there is a lot of places where people have lost their way on this, in my opinion, on the ESG reporting, and that gets reported. So that's why there's a credibility gap, right? And I think all of us who are in this sector really needing information that we can evaluate companies, like even on climate risk, if it's considered to be something that's very qualitative and it's not really credible, I think that's not going to withstand public scrutiny, right, eventually. So I think that's for me, that would be the core issue.
Yeah, well, I'll also say, though, that it's really hard to get the data. I work with venture capital firms. I mean, they're just trying to survive. It's not that they don't want to provide the data, it's just sometimes really difficult to get some of the sustainability data. And for big companies, they're spending a lot of money. So it's creating a cost for all this compliance. So I kind of look at it like, I think this is just my personal view, that we should be willing to have a little messiness to accomplish the big picture. Because if you make it so difficult for companies to pursue sustainability goals, and there's so much concern about greenwashing that people back away from it, then you've completely lost your mission. And so here's an analogy that I don't know if this is going to make sense to anyone, but okay, if you're running a store, what's a retail store around here? Like we have Belk's or Neiman Marcus or Nordstrom's. If you're running a store.
Okay, that's not the neighborhood I live in, guys.
Or whatever store. I'm just trying to come up with something that's a national
How about
brand.
Dollar Tree?
Okay, Dollar. Okay, you're running a store. You're probably going to have some shoplifting. Okay, there's probably going to be some shoplifting. And yeah, maybe it's 10% of your inventory gets shoplifted. Maybe it's 20% gets shoplifted. It's kind of a cost of doing business. No, okay, this is totally my point of view. It's just sort of a cost of doing business. If you're in the lending business, you're going to have some credit losses. It's a cost of doing business. So do you want to shut down your entire store because one thing got shoplifted? So what's your tolerance level? I mean, nothing is perfect. So what's your tolerance level? 10% shrinkage, 20%? There's going to be a little messiness. Are you going to shut down the entire operation because there's a little bit of shoplifting? That's kind of how I look. Okay, this is
Lori,
not
I think
associated with any companies I work for. This is my point of view, that you have to tolerate a little bit to get the bigger picture.
But Lori, you would agree that the company should report that there's a 10% loss, right? I mean, if that's I think that's the challenge,
okay.
right? So I don't think what we're talking about is inconsistent, but I think it's really about what Lori's talking about is the tolerance about goal setting and what requirement you meet. And what I was getting at is, do you report that?
No, I'm saying that 10% of what I'm saying is you just got to tolerate that 10% of the companies are going to be doing some greenwashing. But you don't shut the whole effort down because you got a few companies that are maybe pushing it. Because I feel that especially in Europe, there's so much regulation that companies are getting out of sustainable investing because they can't meet the requirements and they're so worried about getting sued or fined, they're just getting out of the business. So then you've kind of, thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So you've lost the investment and the pursuit of it because companies are scared that they're going to get fined. So that's like an alternate view on this topic.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. And as an undergraduate, the reason that I'm making the point that I'm making is that you're all going to be going out and perhaps finding jobs in this sector, right? Doing ESG reporting. So I think it's important to understand what Lori's saying about the overall market effect of this, but also to understand that how you report that information, the credibility and the methods that you bring to it is going to be very important for people who are learning how to do that right now. So. And any other?
You have
Yeah.
I think the nuances there too. So you
Yeah.
have corporate sustainability, you have ESG, which are the measures that metrics used to
Right.
measure how a company's doing on their corporate sustainability efforts, and then who the user is of that
Yep,
information.
that's
So
right.
Is it an investor? Because if an investor is using that money to make investment or that information to make investment decisions, then they need to understand what assumptions were gone into that, so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
true.
that's
No,
right.
no, that,
Space too, I think. it's
That's right.
so just, it gets very deep, and so. just knowing
yeah,
where
that's a
it's
good point.
going
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And this is going to be the same with the climate risk reporting, right?
Mhm.
It's all the same issues are going to be relevant there. Anything else? Okay, this time, no snaps. How about putting your hand together for appreciation?
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you,
I
Lori.
enjoyed